Al Capone was a name that struck fear into the hearts of millions. He was a figure who defined an era of violence, greed, and unparalleled influence. Born into poverty in Brooklyn, New York, Capone was destined for greatness, but not in a conventional sense. His rise from an unknown Italian immigrant to the feared kingpin of Chicago's criminal empire was nothing short of legendary. It was a story that unfolded in the shadows of the Prohibition era, when the streets of America became a battlefield for those who sought to profit from the country's thirst for alcohol, gambling, and corruption. But what made Capone truly stand out wasn't just his ability to dominate the criminal world, it was his silence. The man built an empire on the quiet understanding that power didn't need to be loudly proclaimed. It didn't need to be flaunted. Capone understood something that few others did: silence, in the right hands, could be just as powerful as any weapon. While rival gangsters shouted about their victories and threatened with open displays of violence, Capone knew how to remain just out of reach, lurking in the background like a shadow, his presence felt but never seen. His power wasn't in his words, but in his ability to manipulate, control, and crush anyone who dared to stand in his way. The streets of Chicago, during the 1920s, were a maze of dark alleys, speakeasies, and underground bars. It was a city that, despite its vibrant cultural scene, was being suffocated by the grip of organized crime. And at the heart of it all was Al Capone. He wasn't just another gangster trying to make a name for himself. He was a mastermind, orchestrating the vast network of illicit activities that would make him the most powerful man in the city. But even more impressive was how he did it all while keeping a low profile. While other crime bosses reveled in their fame, Capone remained elusive, a silent force who operated from the shadows. To understand Capone's rise, you have to understand the context of the time. The United States was in the midst of Prohibition, a time when the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol were banned. But instead of eradicating alcohol consumption, Prohibition only made it more profitable. Speakeasies and underground bars sprang up all over the country, and organized crime syndicates took full advantage of the lawlessness. Al Capone, with his sharp instincts and ruthless drive, was quick to seize control of Chicago's bootlegging operations, turning what was once a small-time hustle into a multi-million-dollar empire. But Capone wasn't just a bootlegger. He was much more than that. His operations spanned the entire city, from gambling rackets to prostitution rings, from the corrupt police force to the politicians in his back pocket. Capone's influence reached every corner of Chicago. He had the city in his grip, and nothing could shake him. While other gangsters relied on brute force and public intimidation, Capone's power came from his ability to keep things quiet. His operations were run with precision and secrecy, and anyone who dared cross him was swiftly and silently eliminated. The fear Capone instilled wasn't just about what he could do, it was about what he wouldn't do. He didn't boast, didn't make threats, didn't show off his wealth or power. Instead, he let the fear of his silent hand do the talking. His ability to remain out of the public eye, to be a ghost in a city of noise, made him all the more terrifying. People knew Capone's name, but few had ever seen him. He wasn't like the flashy gangsters who thrived on the limelight. Capone was a man who understood the value of silence, and in that silence, he built an empire that would go down in history. One of the most chilling aspects of Capone's reign was his use of silence to maintain control. In a world where rival gangsters were constantly battling for power and territory, Capone's silence became a weapon. He didn't engage in public feuds or threats, he simply eliminated anyone who got in his way. His silent and efficient methods left no room for error. He wasn't a man to talk about his plans, he simply executed them, quietly, without hesitation. And when it came time to eliminate a rival, he didn't waste time with dramatic showdowns. His orders were swift, precise, and deadly. There was no room for mistakes in Capone's world. Despite his reputation for ruthlessness, Capone also knew how to play the game of public perception. He made sure to maintain a facade of legitimacy, often posing for photos with his family or making public appearances that portrayed him as a respectable businessman. He made sure the people of Chicago saw him as a benefactor, someone who gave back to the community. His generosity, whether it was funding hospitals, creating jobs, or hosting lavish parties, helped create an image of Capone as a man of the people. But beneath this surface, he was the puppet master, pulling the strings of a vast criminal network that was responsible for the city's darkest secrets. But the myth of Capone as a benevolent gangster would only last so long. The law began to close in on him, and Capone's empire started to crumble. Despite his best efforts to keep things under control, cracks began to appear in his carefully constructed facade. As his rivals grew bolder, his grip on Chicago began to loosen. The FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover, was determined to bring Capone down. But unlike other criminals who fell due to violence or public exposure, Capone's downfall came from a surprising source: his own financial records. The man who had built an empire on silence would be undone by the very thing he had so carefully hidden: his wealth. Capone's downfall was as swift as it was inevitable. After years of evading justice, the authorities finally managed to convict him on charges of tax evasion. It was a surprising turn of events, considering how elusive and untouchable he had once seemed. But even in the face of his conviction, Capone remained silent. He was sent to Alcatraz, the most notorious prison in the United States, where he would spend the rest of his days. But even behind bars, Capone's silence remained his most powerful weapon. He spent his final years reflecting on his past, but never once did he openly express regret. His empire, his silence, and his legacy had all been built on the belief that power didn't need to be shouted from the rooftops, it could simply be felt, lurking in the shadows. Al Capone's story is one of contrasts, of a man who built an empire on silence, but whose life ultimately ended in the loud, chaotic reality of imprisonment. It's a story of a man who was feared by all, but never fully understood. His reign over Chicago's criminal underworld was a testament to the power of silence, but it was also a cautionary tale of how even the most powerful men can fall. His legacy remains, but it's a legacy that is as shrouded in mystery and silence as the man himself. Al Capone's story begins not in the luxurious mansions of Chicago but in the crowded streets of Brooklyn, New York, where he was born into a poor Italian immigrant family. The Capones were far from wealthy. His father, Gabriele, worked as a barber, while his mother, Teresa, took care of their large family. Al, the fourth of 9 children, grew up in a world where survival meant hustling for everything, where poverty was a constant companion and the streets were the most important teacher. It was a world that shaped him, that taught him the harsh lessons of survival. From a young age, Al had to learn how to fend for himself. His family wasn't rich, but it was close-knit, and in a neighborhood like theirs, family meant everything. The Capone household was full of love, but also full of struggle. With a father who worked long hours and a mother who was always busy with the house and children, Al had to find ways to entertain himself. But it wasn't the kind of entertainment most children in his neighborhood sought. Brooklyn in the early 1900s wasn't a place for the faint of heart. The streets were full of rough kids, all vying for respect. Young Al wasn't an exception. He grew up around the sights and sounds of street brawls, gang wars, and a culture of survival that was ingrained in the very fabric of his environment. By the time he was a teenager, Al had already been in trouble with the law. It wasn't that he was inherently violent, it was just that he learned early on that in Brooklyn, violence was sometimes the only language people understood. Sharp instinct for reading people, understanding when to push and when to pull back. But the real turning point in his life came when he was expelled from school for a violent incident. This marked the moment Al would never look back. School had never been a place where he felt he could thrive, and the streets offered an entirely different kind of education. Al's early experiences with the criminal underworld were more accidental than intentional. It wasn't that he had grand ambitions of becoming a mob boss, rather, he was simply a product of his environment. But it wasn't long before the organized crime world took notice of him. In his late teens, Al met Johnny Torrio, a powerful figure in the Italian-American crime scene, who would become a mentor and an influential figure in Al's life. Torrio, a man of quiet confidence, saw something in the young Al, a drive, a determination, and a ruthlessness that made him stand out. Torrio was a seasoned gangster who had worked his way up in the world of bootlegging and racketeering, and he was looking for someone who could eventually take over his operations in Chicago. At first, Al wasn't sure if he was cut out for the criminal life. But Torrio's persuasive nature, combined with Al's own innate ambition, soon won him over. The streets of Chicago in the early 1920s were a far cry from the narrow, crowded alleys of Brooklyn. The Windy City was a bustling metropolis, teeming with opportunities, but also rife with crime. As Prohibition kicked in, the demand for illegal alcohol skyrocketed, and Chicago became ground zero for bootlegging operations. Torrio, who had moved to Chicago in the early 1900s, was already a major player in the city's underworld. It didn't take long for Al to realize that this was the place where he could build his empire. Under Torrio's wing, Capone began to expand his influence, quickly moving up the ranks. Capone's natural charisma and ruthless ambition made him a quick study, and before long, he was running some of Torrio's most profitable rackets. Capone understood the power of control over people, control over territory, and control over the flow of illegal goods. While his competitors relied on brute force and public displays of violence, Capone preferred a more subtle approach. It was about making others afraid without saying a word. By the time Capone was in his early 20s, he was already making a name for himself in Chicago. He quickly became involved in the city's bootlegging industry, capitalizing on the high demand for alcohol. But Capone wasn't just another small-time bootlegger. He had a vision. He knew that the key to making a fortune wasn't just about selling alcohol, it was about controlling the entire network of distribution. From the bars to the speakeasies, from the corrupt politicians to the police officers on his payroll, Capone built a vast empire that spanned the entire city. Unlike other gangsters who focused on small-time schemes, Capone played the long game. He saw the big picture and made moves that would ensure his dominance for years to come. The first taste of true power came when Capone took control of the Chicago outfit. In a city where gangsters frequently battled for dominance, Capone emerged as a dominant force. His rise to power wasn't marked by loud gunfights or public confrontations, it was a quiet takeover, a strategic move that saw Capone outmaneuver his rivals. Through a combination of cunning deals, carefully timed violence, and clever manipulation, Capone was able to slowly eliminate his competitors, taking control of the city's most lucrative illegal operations. By 1925, Capone was the undisputed king of Chicago's underworld. He wasn't just a gangster, he was a businessman, running his operations with the precision of a corporate CEO. But what made Capone different from other mobsters was his ability to stay out of the spotlight. While other gangsters reveled in their fame, Capone remained behind the scenes, operating in silence. Capone's ability to control the city wasn't just about violence, it was about influence. He didn't just run his criminal operations, he ran the city itself. Through a vast network of corrupt politicians, police officers, and businessmen, Capone ensured that the authorities turned a blind eye to his activities. In return for protection, Capone funded political campaigns, bribed police officers, and made generous donations to charity, all the while increasing his wealth and influence. Capone was also laying the groundwork for his eventual downfall. He had made too many enemies, and the more powerful he became, the more vulnerable he was to those who would eventually try to bring him down. In the early days, Capone was untouchable, but as his empire grew, so did the number of people who wanted to see him fall. Capone's reputation as a ruthless gangster was soon cemented in the public eye. The media took notice of him, and the press fed the public's fascination with his criminal empire. But Capone was never one to court the media, in fact, he avoided it as much as possible. He didn't want to be seen as just another gangster, he wanted to be seen as a legitimate businessman, a man of power who could walk among the elite. His image as a philanthropist, a family man, and a successful businessman was carefully cultivated, making it easier for him to continue his operations without attracting too much attention. Capone was a master of creating the illusion of respectability, and it worked. He was adored by some, feared by many, but never fully understood. Beneath the surface, however, his empire was a house of cards, fragile and susceptible to collapse. What Capone couldn't control, no matter how hard he tried, was the increasing pressure from law enforcement and his growing number of enemies. But at this stage, Capone was still untouchable, his rise only beginning. By the time Al Capone reached his early 20s, he had already earned a reputation that would set the stage for his meteoric rise in Chicago's criminal underworld. But before he could become the feared kingpin he would later be remembered as, he had to prove himself capable of handling the harsh, chaotic world of organized crime. This world was full of competitors, where every move could be the difference between life and death. And yet, Capone wasn't just another player in the game. He was a man with a vision, one that would eventually transform him into a figure whose name would echo in infamy for generations to come. Capone's real breakthrough into the criminal world began when he left Brooklyn behind and moved to Chicago, a city teeming with opportunity. It was here that he would meet Johnny Torrio, a man who would serve as his mentor and eventual partner in the rise of one of the most powerful crime syndicates in American history. Torrio, having established his own foothold in Chicago's burgeoning criminal scene, quickly saw potential in Capone. An ability to read people made him the perfect candidate to help take Torrio's operations to new heights. Chicago was a city on the edge, gripped by prohibition and brimming with a lawless spirit. The ban on alcohol had created a perfect storm for organized crime to flourish, and Capone was in the right place at the right time. The streets were lined with speakeasies, where alcohol flowed freely, and illegal trade boomed. The demand for alcohol didn't stop just because it was illegal. If anything, it fueled the fire. Capone wasn't the first to see this opportunity, but his approach to taking control of it was what set him apart. He wasn't content to simply make money selling booze. Capone saw the bigger picture. He understood that the key to real power wasn't in the product itself, but in controlling the entire network, the bootleggers, the distribution routes, and, most importantly, the people who could make it all happen. Under Torrio's guidance, Capone began learning the intricate details of the criminal trade. But it didn't take long for Capone to rise beyond mere apprenticeship. He was hungry, fiercely ambitious, and deeply aware of the need to eliminate competitors quickly and efficiently. Capone knew that, in the world he was entering, hesitation was as dangerous as weakness. To survive, he would have to strike first, and strike hard. This was a lesson Capone learned early, and it shaped every move he made afterward. His first taste of real power came when Torrio, recognizing Capone's growing influence and success, handed over control of certain operations in Chicago, effectively giving him a taste of what it would be like to be in charge. From that moment on, Capone was no longer just an employee, he was a key player in the game. Capone's method was simple yet effective: he expanded. While many other crime bosses were content to control small territories, Capone understood that in order to truly dominate, he would need to control everything. He knew that success wasn't just about taking over rival operations, it was about building an empire that could withstand any challenge. This meant infiltrating every part of the city's criminal infrastructure. Capone expanded his reach into the lucrative markets of gambling, prostitution, and loan sharking, all while keeping a tight grip on the most profitable business of all, bootlegging. His operations were not limited to just a few speakeasies or local bars. Capone had entire networks set up that stretched across the city and beyond, making him a force to be reckoned with. But as Capone's influence grew, so did the dangers. The underworld of Chicago was a battleground, with rival gangs and ambitious players constantly vying for control. One of Capone's most formidable rivals was George "Bugs" Moran, the head of the North Side Gang. Moran was a seasoned gangster who had his own empire, and he wasn't afraid to challenge Capone for dominance in Chicago's underworld. Their conflict was inevitable. In the world of organized crime, the fight for territory was constant, and the rules were simple: you either took what you wanted, or someone would take it from you. As Capone began to expand his power, he couldn't afford to let Moran, or anyone else, stand in his way. The war between Capone and Moran would come to a head in 1929, in one of the most infamous and brutal moments of Capone's career, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. But before that, the tension between the two men had been building for years. Capone had already made several attempts to eliminate Moran and his gang, but Moran always managed to slip away. Capone's patience was running thin, and he knew that in order to secure his empire, he would have to make a bold statement. The massacre itself would be a moment of both triumph and tragedy for Capone, a turning point that would solidify his reputation as one of the most feared men in the country, but also draw the unwanted attention of the law. While Capone's violent methods were often the most effective way to deal with his rivals, they also brought unwanted scrutiny. As the body count mounted, so did the efforts of law enforcement to bring him down. But Capone, who had built his empire on secrecy, understood the importance of staying one step ahead. His ability to remain out of the public eye, to operate in the shadows, was key to his success. While other gangsters flaunted their wealth and power, Capone remained elusive, a silent figure whose presence was more felt than seen. In the early days of his rise to power, Capone used his position wisely. He didn't just control his criminal activities, he made sure that he controlled the city itself. He had people in positions of power, from corrupt police officers to politicians on his payroll. The police, who should have been working to bring him down, were instead paid to turn a blind eye to his activities. With this network in place, Capone was able to keep the authorities at bay, continuing to grow his empire while the city looked the other way. But even as Capone's power seemed unassailable, there were cracks beginning to form in his empire. As Capone continued to build his criminal network, he began to face increasing pressure from both law enforcement and his rivals. The public was starting to take notice, and the authorities were beginning to close in. Capone's most dangerous adversary was the newly formed federal agency, the FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover was determined to bring Capone to justice, but Capone's ability to stay hidden from the law made him a near impossible target. It would take years before the FBI would be able to gather enough evidence to make a charge stick. In the meantime, Capone remained untouchable, operating in his familiar silence. Capone's success wasn't just due to his criminal prowess, it was also his understanding of human nature. He knew how to make people feel indebted to him, how to turn friends into loyal allies and enemies into terrified subordinates. His ability to build and maintain relationships, even in a world filled with backstabbing and violence, was a testament to his skill as a manipulator. He wasn't just feared for his ruthlessness, he was also respected for his intellect. His charisma, coupled with his business acumen, made him a formidable figure in both the criminal world and the public eye. But as much as Capone thrived in the criminal underworld, the very tactics that had made him successful would eventually lead to his downfall. His violence, once a tool for survival, became a liability. His tendency to leave a trail of bodies in his wake, along with his growing arrogance, would ultimately make him a target for the law. Capone had built an empire on silence, but as his power grew, so did his enemies. And the more enemies he made, the more difficult it would become to keep his empire intact. The end of Capone's reign was inevitable. Yet, in the world he had created, there was no room for failure. His rise to power, marked by cold ambition and calculated violence, would soon be followed by a fall, one that would come not at the hands of rival gangsters, but from a far more unexpected source, the law. Al Capone's ability to command fear was unparalleled in the criminal underworld, yet it was also a carefully constructed facade. What made him different from the other mob bosses of his time was his innate understanding that power didn't need to be loudly proclaimed. Capone didn't need to shout to be heard, his very presence was enough. He built his empire in silence, behind closed doors, and his reputation did the rest. In the world of organized crime, silence was power, and Capone was a master of using it to his advantage. He wasn't the sort of gangster who reveled in the spotlight. While other criminals flaunted their wealth and power, Capone remained elusive, the silent puppet master pulling the strings of an empire that sprawled across Chicago and beyond. His face wasn't often seen in public, and his name, though feared, was rarely spoken without a sense of trepidation. Capone understood that in a city like Chicago, where power was won through violence and ruthlessness, those who were loud were often the first to fall. It was those who operated quietly, in the shadows, who ruled for the longest. His method was simple yet profoundly effective: make your enemies think you're always watching, even when you're not. He didn't need to make threats or display his power through excessive violence. His reputation alone was enough to keep people in check. This wasn't a man who needed to be physically present in every situation to control it. Instead, he relied on a network of loyal henchmen, corrupt officials, and politicians who ensured that his will was carried out without question. Capone's power lay in his ability to make his presence known without ever stepping into the spotlight. He didn't need to appear in public, shaking hands or making speeches. He only needed to be mentioned in a hushed tone, and the fear would spread like wildfire. This subtlety was reflected in the way Capone conducted his business. His approach to running his criminal empire was far from chaotic. It was methodical, calculated, and strategic. He ran his operations like a well-oiled machine, where every detail, no matter how small, was carefully planned out. Capone's empire was vast, stretching across every corner of Chicago and reaching into the surrounding areas. It was not just bootlegging that made him rich, it was a network of illicit activities, from gambling to prostitution, from extortion to loan sharking. He controlled it all with an iron grip, but the beauty of it was in how little he had to do directly. The money flowed, the operations ran smoothly, and Capone remained mostly behind the scenes, orchestrating everything from a distance. The violence that was often associated with Capone was also part of this strategy. He didn't engage in mindless bloodshed. His acts of violence were calculated, deliberate, and carried out with the precision of a chess player. Every hit was made to send a message, to assert control over a rival, or to punish a betrayal. Capone understood that violence had its place in the world of organized crime, but it had to be measured. A gunshot, a brutal killing, was an effective tool for maintaining power, but only if it was used sparingly and with great care. The more Capone's enemies knew he was capable of violence, the more reluctant they would be to challenge him. Silence, in Capone's world, spoke louder than any words ever could. But Capone's reign wasn't just about power and fear, it was about control. He knew that in order to truly rule, he needed to control not only the streets but also the systems that governed the city itself. Chicago was a city rife with corruption, and Capone was quick to exploit this weakness. He used his influence to buy off police officers, judges, and politicians, ensuring that no matter what crimes were committed under his watch, the law would look the other way. In return, Capone used his vast wealth and resources to keep his allies happy, showering them with money, favors, and protection. This network of loyalty created a shield around him, one that made it nearly impossible for anyone to bring him down. The public perception of Capone was also carefully curated. While other gangsters tried to establish themselves through intimidation, Capone took a different approach. He wanted to be seen as a man of the people, someone who cared about his community and wasn't just interested in amassing wealth for himself. His philanthropic endeavors, whether they were building hospitals, funding schools, or throwing extravagant charity events, were not simply acts of kindness. They were part of a larger strategy to solidify his position as a legitimate figure in the eyes of the public. Capone wanted to be respected, even admired, by those who were unaware of the darker side of his operations. He knew that if he could cultivate an image of a benevolent businessman, people would be less likely to question his true activities. His generosity was as much a tool for controlling the narrative as it was a way to gain favor. But the facade he built was fragile, and as his empire grew, so did the risks. Capone's rise to power wasn't without its challenges, and as his influence expanded, so did the number of people who wanted to take him down. The more powerful he became, the more enemies he accumulated. Some of these enemies were fellow gangsters, eager to claim the throne for themselves. Others were the law enforcement officers who had begun to take notice of Capone's increasing reach. The quiet man who had once ruled from the shadows was now facing the very real possibility of being dragged into the light. As Capone's enemies grew bolder, Capone's need to protect his empire became even more pressing. He began to realize that he couldn't control everything from behind the scenes forever. The violence escalated, as did his need to eliminate any threats that came his way. The tension between maintaining his quiet, calculating power and the need to defend his empire with increasingly brutal force became a delicate balancing act. Capone's silence, once his greatest strength, now felt more like a double-edged sword. His ability to remain out of the public eye allowed him to operate in the dark, but it also made him vulnerable. Those who operated in silence were often the first to be exposed when the light finally shined upon them. This internal conflict manifested itself in many ways. Capone's once ironclad control of Chicago began to show cracks. His rivals started to challenge him more aggressively, and law enforcement, though still largely ineffective, began to close in on his operations. As the walls started to close in, Capone was forced to adapt. He could no longer rely solely on silence and manipulation, he needed to act decisively, even if it meant exposing himself to the world in ways he had always avoided. The turning point came with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, a brutal act of violence that would forever change the course of Capone's life. While Capone's silence had kept him at the top for so long, this massacre marked the moment when his violent methods would take center stage. The murder of 7 members of the Moran gang was not just a killing, it was a statement, a declaration of Capone's dominance. But it was also the moment when his careful balance of power began to unravel. The massacre caught the attention of the public, the media, and, most importantly, the law. Capone's reign, built on a foundation of silence, was starting to be threatened by the very violence he had once used so sparingly. As the authorities ramped up their efforts to bring him down, Capone's empire slowly began to fall apart. His once invincible control over the city started to slip. The silence that had been his greatest asset now became his greatest liability. Capone was no longer able to control the narrative, he was forced to defend himself in ways he had never imagined. The silent king of Chicago was being dragged into the public eye, and his carefully constructed empire was starting to crumble. The story of Capone's reign is one of contrasts, a man who built an empire on silence, but whose downfall came when the silence was finally broken. The methods that had allowed him to rise to power became the very things that brought about his downfall. As the pressure mounted and his enemies closed in, Capone found himself fighting to maintain control in a world where silence was no longer enough. He had created a kingdom of fear, but fear was a fickle thing, and as Capone's empire fell, it became clear that the silence he had once relied on could no longer protect him. As Capone's empire grew in power, so did his reputation. His ability to control the streets of Chicago and eliminate rivals with ruthless precision made him an icon in the criminal world. But with this growing power came inevitable scrutiny, and the authorities soon began to close in. Capone's world, built on a web of corruption, violence, and influence, was no longer as secure as it once had been. His silence, which had served him so well in the past, began to feel like a fragile veil over a much darker truth. As his enemies multiplied and law enforcement began to shift its focus, Capone's downfall seemed inevitable. But what would ultimately bring him to his knees wasn't another gangster, a rival from the streets, it would be the very thing he thought he had under control, the law. The United States, in the 1920s, was a country undergoing rapid change. The era of Prohibition, which had been designed to curb alcohol consumption, had instead given birth to an underground empire of bootleggers, speakeasies, and organized crime. Chicago, under Capone's iron grip, became the heart of this illegal trade. The city was flooded with alcohol, much of it supplied by Capone's operation, which controlled every aspect of the bootlegging industry. With the federal government unable to curb the flow of alcohol, local law enforcement either looked the other way or, worse, became complicit in Capone's rise. For years, Capone had been untouchable, operating with impunity while corrupt officials and police officers ensured his reign. He had built a kingdom where money could buy loyalty and silence. His power was built on a complex system of bribery, manipulation, and fear. He had allies in the political world, law enforcement, and even within the very fabric of the legal system. These allies turned a blind eye to his activities, allowing him to operate without fear of arrest. But the deeper Capone went into the world of crime, the more vulnerable he became. It was a truth he refused to acknowledge until it was too late. Power, once acquired, had to be defended, and in Capone's case, it was being threatened from all sides. The federal government had been aware of Capone's operations for years, but it was difficult to make a case against him. Proving that he was behind the vast criminal empire he controlled was nearly impossible. His operations were cloaked in layers of secrecy, and his influence over local officials kept any meaningful investigation at bay. It wasn't until a man named Elliot Ness and his team of agents, known as the Untouchables, began to focus their attention on Capone that the tides began to shift. Ness, a federal prohibition agent, was determined to take down Capone, but it was a challenge that seemed insurmountable. Ness and his team worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, making arrests, and slowly chipping away at the layers of protection Capone had built around himself. But it wasn't easy, and for a long time, it seemed like Capone would always slip through their fingers. Capone, meanwhile, continued to live his life as though he were untouchable. He maintained his public image as a respectable businessman and philanthropist, ensuring that his criminal activities remained hidden behind a veil of legitimacy. He had built relationships with powerful figures in the city, from the mayor to police chiefs, and his carefully curated public persona made it difficult for anyone to challenge him directly. He was a man who moved in the shadows, making his fortune off the vices of others, while maintaining the image of a well-to-do businessman. But as the pressure from law enforcement grew, Capone found that his carefully constructed world was beginning to unravel. The tipping point came when Capone was arrested for tax evasion. It was a charge that seemed almost trivial in comparison to the mountain of criminal activities he had been involved in, from bootlegging to murder, but it was also the one thing that could finally bring him down. The government, unable to make a solid case against him for his many violent crimes, decided to focus on his finances. Capone had made millions from his illegal activities, and the authorities knew that if they could prove he had been evading taxes on that wealth, they would have enough to imprison him. This tactic was a sharp turn from the traditional methods used to take down criminals, but in Capone's case, it would prove to be the Achilles heel. The trial was a long and complicated process, and Capone's legal team fought hard to protect him. They attempted to discredit the evidence against him, hoping to create enough doubt to secure an acquittal. But the government had done its homework. The IRS had spent months investigating Capone's finances, painstakingly compiling evidence of his illegal earnings and his efforts to hide them. For the first time, Capone found himself on the defensive. The quiet man who had once dominated Chicago with fear and manipulation was now forced to face the full weight of the law. Despite the best efforts of his legal team, Capone was convicted of tax evasion in 1931. It was a stunning defeat for the once mighty gangster, whose empire had seemed so invincible just a few years earlier. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, a sentence that would mark the beginning of the end for his criminal reign. But even behind bars, Capone's story was far from over. The once feared boss of Chicago's criminal underworld was now a prisoner, but his legacy, and his grip on the city, would linger long after his fall from grace. Capone's time in prison was not an easy one. Though he had once been the master of Chicago, now he was just another inmate in the notoriously harsh environment of Alcatraz. The prison, located on an island off the coast of California, was known for its strict discipline and difficult conditions. Capone, once a kingpin, was now a shadow of his former self. His health deteriorated rapidly, and the man who had once controlled an empire with ruthless efficiency was now a prisoner of his own making. His mind, once sharp and calculating, began to falter. The silence that had once been his greatest weapon now became his greatest enemy. In the isolation of his cell, Capone was forced to confront the reality of his fall from power. As Capone's health declined, so did his once legendary reputation. The man who had built an empire on fear, silence, and manipulation was now a broken man, struggling to survive behind bars. His criminal empire, which had once seemed so invulnerable, was no more. The authorities had succeeded in bringing him down, not through force or violence, but through a methodical approach that focused on the very thing Capone thought he had under control, his finances. Capone's fall from grace was a reminder of the fragility of power. For all his cunning, for all his ability to manipulate those around him, Capone couldn't escape the long arm of the law forever. The legacy he left behind was one of contrasts, of a man who built an empire on silence, but whose downfall came because he couldn't keep his secrets hidden forever. His story serves as a cautionary tale: no matter how powerful, how ruthless, or how silent you may be, there is always a reckoning. And when that reckoning comes, even the mightiest empires crumble. In the end, Al Capone's name would live on in the annals of history as one of the most infamous figures in American crime. His story became the stuff of legend, an enduring symbol of the allure and danger of the gangster life. But behind the myth, behind the power and fear, there was a man who once ruled Chicago from the shadows. And in the end, even the shadow of Al Capone faded into history, a silent reminder of a time when power was built on fear, and lost to the law. Al Capone's arrest in 1931 and subsequent conviction for tax evasion marked the beginning of the end for his reign over Chicago's criminal empire. Despite his earlier triumphs and dominance over the city's underworld, the fall from power was swift, and for Capone, prison was a bitter and humbling experience. The notorious gangster, who had once been untouchable, now found himself in the cold, isolated confines of Alcatraz, a federal penitentiary that would become both his prison and his tomb in more ways than one. But as he sat in his cell, with the weight of his crimes and his legacy bearing down on him, Capone's story was far from over. Even in the confines of his prison cell, the man who once held an empire in his hands would still be remembered, his name forever tied to a period of history that fascinated and repelled. Capone's time in Alcatraz, the most infamous prison in America, was not the peaceful, calculated existence he had led in his earlier years. Alcatraz, known for its harsh conditions and strict rules, was not a place for a man like Capone. The prison was designed to break the will of even the most hardened criminals, and it seemed to have done so with Capone. Unlike his previous life, where he could command respect and orchestrate his empire from behind the scenes, Alcatraz stripped him of everything that had once made him powerful. No longer could he pull strings or intimidate his fellow inmates with the fear that had once defined him. Instead, Capone was relegated to the same fate as the other criminals, lost in the grind of daily prison life. The man who had controlled an entire city now had little more than his thoughts to keep him company, and even those seemed to be slipping away. The physical and mental toll on Capone was immediate. He was no longer the sharp, calculating mastermind he had once been. In the months that followed his incarceration, Capone's health began to deteriorate. He had always been a man known for his robust energy, but now, he seemed a shadow of himself. Prison life was brutal on him, both physically and mentally. The stress of his arrest, the constant scrutiny from fellow inmates, and the crushing reality of his fall from grace took a toll on his psyche. Capone, once a fearsome and revered figure, was now struggling with both physical ailments and the mental scars of his past decisions. The infamous gangster who had once operated in the shadows of Chicago, making decisions with the ruthlessness of a CEO, now found himself unable to escape the brutal reality of prison life. He was often seen walking the cold, dimly lit halls of Alcatraz, his face haggard, his eyes distant, as if the fire that once burned inside him had gone out. His health issues, which had been a concern for years, only worsened in the confined space of the penitentiary. The syphilis that had been slowly eating away at his mind began to take its toll, causing hallucinations and affecting his ability to think clearly. The man who had been known for his sharp intelligence and strategic thinking could no longer rely on those traits as he once had. It was a sad irony that the very mind that had allowed him to rule Chicago so effectively was now deteriorating in front of him, leaving him vulnerable in a place he had never expected to be, in the hands of others. Capone's condition worsened to the point where he was eventually transferred to a less restrictive prison in Florida, but his physical decline had already begun. His days of controlling anything, whether it be the streets of Chicago or even his own body, were over. The syphilis had taken its toll, and by the time he was released from prison in 1939, Capone was a shell of the man he had once been. He could no longer operate in the world of power he had built. His mental faculties had deteriorated so much that even his closest associates could see that the once dominant gangster was no more. Capone spent his final years in relative obscurity, living in a mansion in Palm Island, Florida, far from the streets of Chicago that had once been his kingdom. The public image of Capone had been a carefully crafted facade, an image of wealth, power, and ruthless control. But the reality was much darker. Now, Capone was just another man, plagued by the consequences of his own actions. His health had deteriorated to the point where he was barely able to leave his home. The syphilis, which had ravaged his body for years, finally claimed his life in 1947. Capone's death was far from the dramatic end one might expect for a figure of his stature. There were no grand confrontations or final moments of glory. His passing was quiet, marked by the slow, inevitable decline that had been in the making for years. Despite the decline in his physical and mental health, Capone's legacy as one of the most notorious figures in American crime continued to linger long after his death. The mythology surrounding Capone only grew after his passing, his name forever linked to the violent, Prohibition-era days of Chicago. His rise and fall became a symbol of the power and danger of the gangster life, a life of ambition, violence, and corruption. His story has been told and retold in countless books, movies, and documentaries, further cementing his place in American history as one of the most iconic criminals to ever live. Capone's fall from grace, from the heights of power to the depths of prison, is a powerful reminder of the fragile nature of power. No matter how ruthless, how cunning, or how violent a person may be, there is always a limit to what they can control. The man who had once ruled Chicago with an iron fist, who had manipulated the political and legal systems to protect himself, was eventually brought down not by his enemies or the law, but by the very disease he had carried for so long, silently eating away at him. In the end, Capone was a man who had everything, and lost it all, his empire, his health, his mind, until all that was left was the shadow of the man who had once been feared by all. Today, Capone's legacy is an enduring part of American pop culture. His name evokes images of the Roaring Twenties, of speakeasies, jazz clubs, and the rise of organized crime. He is a symbol of both the allure and the danger of the gangster life, and his story is one that continues to captivate the imagination of people around the world. Yet, beneath the myth and the glamour, Capone's story is a tragic one, a tale of a man who reached the heights of power only to fall victim to his own vices. His life serves as a cautionary tale, not only about the dangers of living a life of crime, but also about the eventual cost of power when it is built on a foundation of corruption, violence, and fear. Even the mightiest empire can fall, and even the most ruthless man can be brought to his knees by the inevitable consequences of his actions. The legend of Al Capone is one that will likely never fade from the public consciousness. His name is synonymous with crime, power, and the tumultuous history of the Prohibition era. But as time goes on, Capone's story transforms from one of awe and fascination to one of melancholy. He is remembered as a man who had it all but lost it in the end, his legacy tarnished by the very actions that had once made him a king. The rise and fall of Al Capone is one of the most iconic stories in American history, a story that continues to resonate, reminding us all of the fragility of power and the cost of ambition when it is built on a foundation of violence and deceit. Al Capone's name became synonymous with the golden age of American crime, an era when gangsters ruled the streets, corruption ran rampant, and the law seemed powerless to stop them. His story, however, is not just one of crime and violence, it is the story of a man who built an empire on ambition and ruthlessness, only to see it crumble beneath the weight of his own decisions. Even as he sat in his prison cell, his health deteriorating and his power slipping away, Capone remained a figure whose shadow still loomed large over Chicago and the country as a whole. Capone's empire had been built on the back of Prohibition, a time when alcohol was outlawed across the United States, yet demand for it never waned. This created a fertile ground for organized crime to thrive. Capone's rise to prominence began in the early 1920s when he arrived in Chicago, where a combination of strategic alliances and an uncanny ability to read people helped him ascend to the top of the city's underworld. His ties to Johnny Torrio, the Italian crime boss who initially mentored him, were instrumental in Capone's success. Under Torrio's guidance, Capone learned the ropes of the illegal trade, and when Torrio eventually retired, Capone was ready to take control. At first, Capone's focus was on bootlegging, the illegal distribution of alcohol, but as he expanded his reach, he moved into other areas of crime, such as gambling, extortion, and prostitution. Capone was able to take control of the south side of Chicago with impressive speed, using his charisma, cunning, and sheer force of will to secure his position. He established a highly organized crime syndicate that had its hands in nearly every illegal business in the city. His reputation for violence was legendary, rivals were eliminated with swift and brutal efficiency. He ran his operation like a well-oiled machine, with each member of his organization knowing their place and executing their duties without question. But Capone was more than just a ruthless gangster. He understood the importance of maintaining a positive public image. He was careful to cultivate an image of a businessman, a philanthropist even, giving large sums of money to charities and publicly associating himself with civic causes. This allowed him to maintain a degree of legitimacy in the eyes of the public, which in turn protected him from law enforcement. Capone knew that as long as the public continued to view him as a benefactor, they would be less likely to turn on him. And for a time, this strategy worked. Capone's influence extended beyond just the criminal underworld. He had allies in high places, politicians, judges, police officers, men who were willing to look the other way in exchange for the money and favors Capone provided. But no empire, especially one built on crime, can last forever. Capone's rise had been meteoric, but his fall was just as swift. The tipping point came with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, a brutal gangland killing in which 7 members of George "Bugs" Moran's North Side gang were gunned down. Although Capone was never directly linked to the massacre, it was widely believed that it was orchestrated by him. The massacre shocked the city, and more importantly, it caught the attention of the federal government. The brutality of the killings, combined with the growing public outcry, signaled a shift in the approach to dealing with organized crime. No longer was it just a local issue, it had become a national one. Despite Capone's best efforts to remain hidden from the law, his violent methods began to draw the attention of federal authorities. The man who had once been untouchable was no longer able to avoid the gaze of the government. The authorities, however, knew that the key to bringing Capone down wasn't through direct confrontation or attempting to prosecute him for his many murders, it was through his finances. The government's decision to go after Capone for tax evasion, rather than his violent crimes, marked a turning point in his downfall. The IRS, under the leadership of Agent Elliot Ness and his team of untouchables, meticulously built a case against Capone. They began to track his financial records, tracing the money that flowed through his empire. Capone, who had long operated in the shadows, was not prepared for the meticulous work of law enforcement. For all his ruthlessness and ability to control the streets, he had neglected the one area where the law could truly get to him, his finances. The government had a clear strategy: if they could prove that Capone had been evading taxes on his illicit earnings, they could imprison him. They focused on the money, following the trail wherever it led. It wasn't an easy task. Capone had set up complex systems to hide his income, funneling money through legitimate businesses and using intermediaries to distance himself from the operations. But despite his best efforts, the IRS was relentless. The trial that followed Capone's conviction was a spectacle in itself. Capone, once the king of Chicago's criminal world, now found himself in a courtroom, fighting for his freedom. His defense team worked tirelessly to discredit the evidence against him, but the government's case was solid. Capone's own arrogance had played a role in his downfall. He had underestimated the government's determination and had become too comfortable in his power. His once vibrant empire had started to show signs of decay, and Capone's refusal to take the threat of legal action seriously was a fatal mistake. In 1931, after a lengthy trial, Capone was convicted on charges of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. He was also fined $50,000 in order to pay back $215,000 in back taxes. But even as Capone sat behind bars, his influence was not entirely gone. The reputation he had built over the years still loomed large. His name continued to carry weight in Chicago, and many feared the repercussions of crossing him, even from prison. Capone's time in prison, however, was a far cry from the life he had led as a gangster. The once feared man who had ruled the streets from behind the scenes now found himself in the harsh confines of Alcatraz, a federal penitentiary known for its brutal conditions and its ability to break even the most hardened criminals. But even in prison, Capone's reputation remained. He was treated as a celebrity of sorts, given special privileges and kept separate from the general prison population. Yet, despite the relative comfort he experienced in prison, Capone was a shell of his former self. Prison, however, was not where Capone's story ended. His health, which had been in decline for years, worsened significantly during his time at Alcatraz. Syphilis, which he had contracted years earlier, had slowly begun to ravage his body, affecting his mind and his ability to function. Capone's once sharp intellect was dulled, and he began to suffer from bouts of confusion and mental instability. By the time he was released from prison in 1939, Capone was a far cry from the man who had once ruled Chicago with an iron fist. His mind, once a powerful tool in the world of crime, was now broken, and his health continued to decline rapidly. Capone spent the last years of his life in relative obscurity, living on a private estate in Palm Island, Florida. The man who had once been the most powerful gangster in America was now a frail, almost pathetic figure, plagued by the consequences of his own actions. His body and mind, ravaged by years of crime and illness, had betrayed him. In 1947, Capone succumbed to complications from his long-standing illness, dying at the age of 48. His death marked the end of an era, the era of Prohibition, organized crime, and the gangsters who ruled it. But Capone's legacy lived on, forever cementing his place in American history as one of the most infamous criminals of all time. Though his death marked the end of his physical presence in the world, Capone's myth endured. His story became the stuff of legend, immortalized in books, films, and documentaries. His rise to power, his reign of violence and corruption, and his eventual fall became a symbol of the dangers of ambition unchecked by morality. The gangster who had once believed himself untouchable was now a cautionary tale, his empire destroyed not by rival gangsters or law enforcement, but by his own unchecked greed and the inevitable consequences of a life lived on the edge. Capone's story, though tragic, remains a compelling one, filled with the drama of a man who reached the heights of power only to lose everything he had worked for. His life serves as a stark reminder that power, when wielded without regard for the law or for others, is fleeting. The man who once ruled the streets of Chicago now exists only in the shadows of history, his name forever etched into the annals of crime, a symbol of both the promise and the peril of the gangster life. The story of Al Capone is one that feels almost mythological in its scope, a tale of a man who rose from the gritty streets of Brooklyn to become the kingpin of Chicago's criminal empire. But as with many larger-than-life figures, his journey was not simply one of violent triumph, it was also marked by the inevitable collapse of the very empire he had built. The rise of Capone, like many gangsters before him, was propelled by a combination of ruthless ambition, calculated violence, and an uncanny ability to manipulate those around him. But it was his downfall, slow and inexorable, that made his story more than just one of crime. Capone's fall was not only a result of his actions, but also the result of the shifting dynamics of power in America during the 1920s. For many, Al Capone's name is inextricably linked to the period of Prohibition in the United States. When the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was enacted in 1920, banning the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol, it created a void that criminal organizations across the country rushed to fill. The demand for alcohol didn't disappear, if anything, it only increased. And in a city like Chicago, where corruption was rampant and the rule of law seemed optional, it didn't take long for gangsters like Capone to establish themselves. The opportunity was right there for the taking. Chicago was a city of vast wealth, and Capone was just the man to seize it. As a young man, Capone had already shown signs of his future criminal prowess. Born into a poor Italian immigrant family, he had little in the way of opportunities but quickly realized the power and allure of the streets. He first entered the world of crime as a member of the 5 Points Gang in New York, a group led by the notorious gangster Johnny Torrio. Under Torrio's mentorship, Capone moved to Chicago, where he began to make a name for himself. His early days in the city involved running small-time rackets, but it didn't take long before he was working his way up, becoming one of Torrio's most trusted men. Torrio, who saw in Capone a ruthlessness and ambition that mirrored his own, eventually handed over control of his operations to him, effectively making Capone the head of one of Chicago's most powerful crime syndicates. Capone's leadership was defined by his cold pragmatism. He ran his operations with the efficiency of a businessman, understanding that a well-oiled machine was key to maintaining power. His syndicate was responsible for bootlegging, illegal alcohol production and distribution, which was the bread and butter of his business. However, Capone was not content with simply making money off of alcohol. He expanded his operations into gambling, prostitution, and other illicit trades, all while building an infrastructure of corrupt politicians, law enforcement officers, and businessmen who ensured that his empire could function without interference from the authorities. The machine he built was expansive and intricate, its tendrils reaching into nearly every aspect of Chicago's social and political life. But for all his skill and ambition, Capone's rise to power was not without its difficulties. He was constantly in conflict with other gangs, particularly the North Side Gang led by George "Bugs" Moran, which controlled much of Chicago's alcohol distribution. The battle for control of the city was brutal, with violence erupting on the streets and in the back rooms of speakeasies and illegal gambling joints. Capone's gang was known for its ruthlessness, with the so-called Capone mob often resorting to violence to eliminate rivals. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, in 1929, was perhaps the most infamous example of this tactic, a brutal execution-style killing of 7 members of Moran's gang, which shocked the city and the nation. The massacre marked a turning point for Capone. While his control over Chicago's criminal underworld seemed unshakable, it was this very act of brazen violence that would eventually lead to his downfall. The sheer brutality of the massacre, with its public spectacle, put Capone in the spotlight. Before this, Capone had done a masterful job of remaining largely in the shadows, a quiet figure whose influence stretched across the city without ever needing to make an overt public appearance. He was the puppet master, operating from behind the curtain, his hand firmly on the levers of power. But the St. Valentine's Day Massacre changed everything. The sheer scale of the violence turned the public against him, and it led to increased scrutiny from both local and federal law enforcement. At the same time, the country was beginning to shift in its attitude toward organized crime. The government, which had largely turned a blind eye to the illegal activities of gangsters during Prohibition, now began to focus more intently on the growing criminal empires that were profiting from the nationwide ban on alcohol. It was clear that the federal government could no longer ignore the power that men like Capone wielded. The law had to act. It was at this point that Capone's empire began to unravel. The very systems he had put in place to protect himself, his network of corrupt officials and loyal henchmen, were no longer enough to keep him safe from the law. The federal government, using a combination of wiretaps, surveillance, and old-fashioned detective work, began to close in on him. But it wasn't until Capone's finances came under scrutiny that his downfall became inevitable. The federal government realized that the one way to bring Capone down was not through his violent crimes, but through his money. Capone's underestimation of the federal government's determination was his biggest mistake. While he had spent years avoiding the law by operating in the shadows, the government used a new weapon, the IRS. The Internal Revenue Service, led by Treasury Agent Elliot Ness and his team of untouchables, began to gather evidence against Capone for tax evasion. Capone had been making millions from his illegal activities, but he had never bothered to pay taxes on any of that income. He thought himself too powerful to be touched by something as mundane as taxes. But the government, determined to find a way to imprison him, focused their efforts on this vulnerable point. The trial that followed was a spectacle, drawing attention from all over the country. Capone's defense team, one of the best in the nation, fought tooth and nail to discredit the evidence against him. But the government had an airtight case. Capone was convicted on charges of tax evasion in 1931 and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. He was also fined $50,000 in order to pay back over $200,000 in back taxes. The sentencing was a monumental victory for the government and a stunning blow to Capone, who had thought himself invincible. For a man who had spent years eluding the law through his network of influence, the idea of being brought down by something as seemingly trivial as taxes was a bitter irony. However, the victory over Capone was bittersweet. The man who had once been at the peak of American organized crime was now imprisoned, but his empire did not fall overnight. Even from behind bars, Capone continued to exert a degree of influence. His name still carried weight in the criminal underworld, and it would take years for the government to completely dismantle his empire. But Capone's personal downfall was inevitable. As time went on, his health began to deteriorate. He had contracted syphilis at a young age, and the disease slowly ravaged his body, affecting his mental faculties. By the time he was released from prison in 1939, Capone was a shell of his former self, his mind clouded and his health failing. He spent his last years in relative obscurity, far from the streets of Chicago that had once been his kingdom. Capone died in 1947, a tragic end to a life that had been marked by excess and ambition. His story, however, would not end with his death. Capone's name has lived on in the annals of American history, a symbol of the power, the violence, and the allure of the gangster life. His rise to prominence, his reign of terror, and his eventual fall from grace continue to captivate the imagination of people around the world. Yet, beneath the myth and the legend, Capone's life is a cautionary tale, one of a man who reached the peak of power and wealth only to lose it all through his own hubris. His story serves as a reminder of the fragile nature of power and the inevitable consequences of a life built on crime and corruption. Al Capone's empire, once the epitome of organized crime, was not just a network of illicit dealings, it was a microcosm of a larger world in turmoil. Chicago, the city where Capone carved his name into the annals of criminal history, was a place defined by tension. The city's skyline, dotted with towering buildings, was often bathed in the glow of neon signs for speakeasies, places where the law was nothing more than a distant memory, and the lawless thrived in secrecy. This was the world Capone built for himself, but it was also a world that he would ultimately be unable to control forever. The empire he forged was one that relied on the quiet cooperation of corrupt politicians, law enforcement officials, and businessmen. It was a system built on silence, on bribery and coercion, and, as the years wore on, the cracks began to show. Though he had once seemed untouchable, Capone's fate was sealed not by rivals or enemies, but by the weight of his own empire. Capone's strength lay not only in his ability to dominate the streets but also in his understanding of human nature. His rise to power was, in many ways, a lesson in strategic manipulation. He knew that the key to maintaining his control over Chicago was not through violence alone, but through building a network of loyalty and fear. While many gangsters ruled through brute force, Capone understood that to truly thrive, he had to remain hidden behind a veil of legitimacy. He was a master of public relations, presenting himself as a man of wealth and status, as a philanthropist who cared for the poor and the downtrodden. In a city rife with corruption, Capone positioned himself as both a benefactor and a feared leader, walking the delicate line between being a criminal mastermind and a beloved public figure. Despite his attempts to present himself as a man of the people, Capone's violent nature was always lurking just beneath the surface. His early career was marked by brutal confrontations with rival gangs. From the start, he was known for his willingness to use violence to assert his authority. However, Capone's genius lay in his ability to wield violence without ever getting his hands dirty. He became a puppet master, pulling the strings from the shadows while others did his bidding. His influence extended into nearly every aspect of life in Chicago. He had contacts in every sector: politics, law enforcement, business, and even the media. In a city rife with corruption, Capone's criminal enterprise was able to flourish, insulated from the consequences that would have destroyed lesser men. But Capone's power wasn't without its challenges. Rivalries among the various gangs in Chicago were fierce, and the most prominent of these was with the North Side Gang led by George "Bugs" Moran. The two factions had been locked in a bitter battle for control of the city's lucrative bootlegging trade. For years, Capone had managed to outsmart and outmaneuver Moran, using violence when necessary, but also relying on alliances and backroom deals to secure his position. Moran, however, was a stubborn adversary. The conflict between the two men reached its peak on the morning of February 14, 1929, an event that would change the course of Capone's empire forever. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre remains one of the most infamous events in the history of organized crime. 7 members of Moran's gang were gunned down in a Chicago garage in what appeared to be a professional hit. The massacre was a meticulously planned operation, and though Capone was never officially linked to the killings, it was widely believed that he had orchestrated the hit. The massacre shocked not just Chicago but the entire nation. The brutality of the crime was impossible to ignore, and it drew the attention of law enforcement like never before. The public outcry was deafening, and Capone's carefully crafted image as a philanthropist and businessman was forever tarnished. The aftermath of the massacre marked a turning point in Capone's life. The public, which had once admired him as a man who kept the streets safe from the chaos of the Prohibition era, now saw him as a ruthless killer with no regard for human life. The massacre, combined with Capone's rising notoriety, caught the attention of law enforcement officials, who were now determined to take him down. The federal government, which had long turned a blind eye to Capone's operations, began to shift its focus toward the gangster. Capone's empire, which had once seemed invulnerable, was now under siege from all sides. But the greatest threat to Capone's power wasn't the media, or even the public's growing distrust of him. It was the relentless pursuit of justice by the federal government, spearheaded by the team of agents led by Eliot Ness. Ness and his team, known as the Untouchables, were tasked with bringing Capone to justice. The team's mandate was simple: find a way to bring Capone down, by any means necessary. For years, Capone had successfully avoided conviction for his many crimes. His ability to buy off police officers, politicians, and judges had allowed him to continue his operations with impunity. But the Untouchables were different. They were determined to do what no one else had been able to: put Capone behind bars. Ness and his team were relentless in their pursuit of Capone, and they focused their efforts on his finances. While Capone had been able to escape punishment for his many violent crimes, he had overlooked one important detail: his finances were a paper trail waiting to be uncovered. The government had been aware of Capone's illegal operations for years, but it was nearly impossible to catch him on charges related to violence or murder. Instead, they decided to focus on tax evasion, a charge that seemed small in comparison to the mountain of criminal activities Capone had been involved in. But it was the perfect weapon. Capone had made millions of dollars from his illegal enterprises, and the IRS was determined to prove that he had been evading taxes on that wealth. The government's decision to pursue Capone for tax evasion marked the beginning of the end for the gangster. It was a tactical maneuver that capitalized on Capone's own arrogance. He had become so used to operating in the shadows, so confident in his ability to outsmart the law, that he never thought the government would be able to take him down through such a seemingly trivial charge. But Ness and the Untouchables were unrelenting. They gathered evidence, compiled records, and systematically built a case against Capone. For the first time in years, Capone found himself on the defensive, his empire of corruption and crime slowly being dismantled piece by piece. As the trial unfolded, Capone's arrogance began to falter. He had always believed that he was untouchable, that his network of loyalists and corrupt officials would protect him from the long arm of the law. But the government's case against him was airtight. In 1931, after a lengthy trial, Capone was convicted on charges of tax evasion. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, a penalty that would mark the end of his reign over Chicago. His conviction was a monumental victory for the government, and it was a stark reminder of the dangers of underestimating the power of the law. Capone's life in prison was nothing like the power he had once wielded on the streets of Chicago. The prison he was sent to, Alcatraz, a notorious maximum security facility, was a far cry from the luxurious existence he had once enjoyed. His health, already deteriorating from the syphilis he had contracted years earlier, continued to decline. The man who had once been a titan of the criminal world was now reduced to a shadow of his former self, a broken figure trapped within the cold walls of a prison cell. His time in prison was marked by a steady decline in both physical and mental health. The once feared Capone was now a man struggling to hold on to his mind, his empire gone, and his health slipping away. He was eventually released from prison in 1939, but it was clear that Capone was no longer the man he had once been. His mental faculties had been ravaged by the syphilis, and he lived out the final years of his life in relative obscurity. The man who had once ruled Chicago from behind the scenes now spent his days in isolation, far removed from the streets of the city he had once dominated. Capone passed away in 1947, a tragic end to the life of a man who had once seemed invincible. The story of Al Capone is one of both legend and tragedy. His rise to power, his reign of violence, and his eventual downfall serve as a powerful reminder of the fleeting nature of power and the inevitable consequences of a life built on crime. Though Capone's empire crumbled, his name endures, and his story remains a cautionary tale of ambition, corruption, and the limits of power. The city of Chicago may have moved on, but Capone's shadow continues to loom large, a symbol of both the allure and the danger of the gangster life. The life of Al Capone is one of the most compelling, tragic, and cautionary tales in the history of organized crime. As a young man, Capone's ambition was undeniable, but it was his brutal rise to power in the underworld that shaped him into a figure of mythic proportions. His story was one of constant reinvention, as he transitioned from a small-time street thug to the undisputed king of Chicago's criminal empire. And yet, despite his power, influence, and wealth, Capone's life was defined by a singular truth: he could never escape the consequences of the world he had chosen to inhabit. Born into a poor Italian immigrant family in Brooklyn, New York, in 1899, Capone's early life was marked by hardship. His parents, both Italian immigrants, struggled to make ends meet, and Capone, like many young men in his position, quickly found his way into the streets. He wasn't a natural-born gangster. He wasn't born into a mafia family like many others in the world he would eventually come to rule, but Capone's sharp mind, quick wit, and unyielding ambition made him a force to be reckoned with. From a young age, Capone was drawn to the criminal world. His first real taste of organized crime came when he joined the notorious 5 Points gang in New York, where he worked under the guidance of the infamous Johnny Torrio, a seasoned gangster who would later play a pivotal role in shaping Capone's future. It was under Torrio's mentorship that Capone began to understand the nuances of running a criminal empire. Torrio taught him that power was not just about brute force but also about subtlety and strategy. The rise of Prohibition in the United States provided the perfect environment for a man like Capone to thrive. With the production and sale of alcohol outlawed, a black market for booze exploded, creating a demand that Capone would capitalize on. But it wasn't just alcohol that Capone would control. His reach extended into gambling, prostitution, and other illicit activities that allowed him to amass an empire built on violence and fear. Capone's control of Chicago's underworld was nothing short of impressive. He took over the south side of the city and established a monopoly on the illegal alcohol trade. His operations were vast, and Capone's network of corrupt politicians, law enforcement officers, and business figures ensured that his empire remained largely untouchable. He used violence and intimidation to eliminate any competition, but he was also a shrewd businessman who knew when to make alliances and when to go to war. At his peak, Capone's empire stretched across Chicago, and he lived in a world where he could control the flow of money, power, and even the fate of his rivals. But for all his successes, Capone's life was marred by his violent methods. He didn't hesitate to use murder to eliminate those who stood in his way, and his ruthlessness became his trademark. The most infamous of his violent acts was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, where 7 men from the rival Moran gang were gunned down in cold blood. Though Capone was never officially linked to the massacre, it was widely believed that he was behind the hit. The public outcry that followed the massacre was enormous, and the FBI began to focus on Capone as the man responsible for the bloodshed. Despite the efforts of law enforcement, Capone continued to maintain his power and influence, carefully staying just out of reach of the law. His ability to bribe politicians and law enforcement officers allowed him to operate with impunity. Capone's reign, however, was not to last. The very violence that had propelled him to the top of the criminal world would eventually lead to his downfall. The government, which had long ignored Capone's illegal activities, finally decided to take action. The catalyst for this was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which shocked the nation and prompted the federal government to investigate organized crime on a much larger scale. It wasn't enough for the authorities to simply arrest Capone for murder or racketeering, they needed something that could definitively bring him down. That's when they turned their attention to Capone's finances. While Capone had spent years evading the law, he had overlooked one crucial area: taxes. For all his criminal activity, Capone had never bothered to pay taxes on the money he was making. In many ways, he had become too accustomed to the idea that he was untouchable. The government realized that the key to bringing Capone down was through his finances, and they began to build a case against him for tax evasion. It was an unlikely weapon to take down a man who had been so brazen in his criminal exploits, but it proved to be the one that would ultimately end Capone's reign. The investigation was led by Treasury Agent Elliot Ness and his team of untouchables, who were tasked with gathering evidence against Capone. They meticulously followed the money, tracing the millions of dollars that Capone was making through his various illegal operations. The case against him was built on hard evidence, bank records, business transactions, and testimony from people close to Capone, many of whom were willing to cooperate in exchange for leniency. Capone, who had spent years controlling the city's underworld through violence and intimidation, was now at the mercy of a government that was determined to bring him down. Capone's trial for tax evasion began in 1931, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. His defense team, composed of some of the best lawyers in the country, tried to argue that the charges were politically motivated and that Capone had been unfairly targeted by the government. But the jury was not swayed. Capone was convicted on charges of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. The verdict was a landmark victory for law enforcement, but it also marked the beginning of Capone's personal decline. After his conviction, Capone was sent to the infamous Alcatraz prison, where he would spend the next several years of his life. Alcatraz was known for its brutal conditions, and Capone, who had spent his years of power living a life of luxury, now found himself in a starkly different reality. In prison, Capone was stripped of everything that had once defined him: his wealth, his power, and his ability to manipulate those around him. The once feared gangster now had little more than his thoughts to occupy his time. His health, already in decline from syphilis, deteriorated further in prison. Capone, who had once been the embodiment of strength and dominance, was now a broken man. By the time Capone was released from prison in 1939, he was no longer the figure who had once ruled the streets of Chicago. His mind, ravaged by the effects of syphilis, was no longer as sharp as it had once been. He retreated to a private estate in Palm Island, Florida, where he lived the remainder of his life in seclusion. The man who had once controlled the fate of an entire city now spent his days in isolation, his legacy defined by the violence and corruption that had made him a household name. Capone's decline was a tragic end to a life that had once seemed invincible. He died in 1947 at the age of 48, a mere shell of the man he had once been. His legacy, however, lived on. The name Al Capone became synonymous with organized crime, and his story became part of American folklore. Books, films, and documentaries have immortalized him as one of the most infamous criminals in history. Yet, despite the public fascination with his life, Capone's story is also a cautionary tale. It is a story of ambition, power, and corruption, a reminder of the fragility of empire and the cost of living a life built on violence and fear. Capone's downfall was not merely the result of law enforcement's pursuit, it was also the inevitable consequence of a life lived in the shadows, a life in which ambition was unchecked by morality or humanity. His rise was fueled by violence, but his fall came at the hands of the very system he had once sought to control. In the end, Capone's story is a tragedy of excess, a man who had everything but lost it all in the end. His rise and fall serve as a powerful reminder that, no matter how high one may climb, the inevitable consequences of a life built on crime will eventually catch up with them. The downfall of Al Capone, once the most feared gangster in Chicago, was as dramatic and inevitable as his rise to power. A man who had ruled over an empire built on blood and violence, Capone's life had always been one of calculated risk and ruthless decision-making. But when he was eventually brought to justice, it wasn't the lawlessness of his daily life or the bodies left in his wake that took him down, it was the meticulous work of law enforcement and the persistence of those who refused to let him escape justice. Capone's story is often painted with broad strokes, the glamorous rise, the golden years of his empire, and the eventual fall that seemed as though it would come for anyone who lived the life he did. But beneath the surface, the unraveling of Capone's empire tells a much more nuanced tale, a story of how even the mightiest can be undone, not by their enemies or rivals, but by the very systems that they thought they had mastered. For much of Capone's life, he was untouchable, existing outside the bounds of the law. Prohibition had created an environment in which criminal activity could flourish, and Capone knew exactly how to exploit it. Chicago was a city in chaos, its streets ruled by gangs who fought tooth and nail for control of the alcohol trade. But Capone didn't just fight for control, he took it. His rise to power was swift and brutal, built on an understanding of the underworld's codes, and his ability to manipulate people to get what he wanted. When Capone arrived in Chicago in the early 1920s, he was a young man with a reputation for both his violent tendencies and his sharp business acumen. His mentor, Johnny Torrio, the boss of the Chicago outfit, had already established a foothold in the city's illegal alcohol trade. Torrio was no stranger to the dangers of the business, and he recognized that Capone, with his street-smart attitude and willingness to do whatever it took, was someone who could help expand the outfit's operations. When Torrio was eventually wounded in a failed assassination attempt and decided to retire, Capone assumed control, marking the beginning of his reign over Chicago's criminal underworld. Capone's empire was built on bootlegging, but it was also a sophisticated web of extortion, bribery, and violent intimidation. Under his leadership, the Chicago outfit grew rapidly, with Capone using a combination of brutal force and strategic alliances to eliminate his competitors and expand his territory. His criminal network extended beyond just alcohol, gambling, prostitution, and even labor racketeering all fell under Capone's control. The streets of Chicago were awash with money, and Capone's operations were so deeply entrenched that they seemed impervious to the law. At his height, Capone's power was almost absolute. He controlled entire neighborhoods, and his influence stretched into every corner of the city. Politicians, judges, and police officers were all on his payroll, ensuring that his empire ran smoothly and without interference. For a time, Capone was not only the king of Chicago's underworld, but also a figure of public admiration. He used his wealth to build schools, hospitals, and orphanages, cultivating an image of the benevolent gangster, a man who cared about his community. The public, enamored with his larger-than-life persona, turned a blind eye to his criminal activities, and Capone relished in this perception. However, the cracks in Capone's carefully crafted image began to show as his power continued to grow. His methods became more violent and erratic, and his tendency to eliminate rivals with swift brutality started to draw attention. The most infamous example of this was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, when 7 members of the rival Moran gang were gunned down in cold blood. Though Capone was never directly linked to the killings, it was widely believed that he had orchestrated the attack in an effort to eliminate Moran and secure his hold over the city's bootlegging operations. The massacre was a turning point for Capone. While he had once been able to operate in the shadows, avoiding the law and public scrutiny, the brutality of the massacre changed everything. The public was horrified, and law enforcement could no longer ignore the extent of Capone's criminal activities. The massacre caught the attention of the federal government, and Capone, who had once been untouchable, now found himself the target of a nationwide manhunt. But while Capone's power in Chicago remained largely unchallenged, his empire was beginning to show signs of weakness. The real turning point in Capone's story, however, came not from the violence of his criminal actions, but from the very system he had so carefully manipulated. While Capone had been adept at evading prosecution for his violent crimes, he had underestimated one crucial aspect of his empire: his finances. Capone had been living a life of luxury, surrounded by wealth and opulence, but he had never bothered to pay taxes on his earnings. The federal government, realizing that they could never convict Capone on charges of murder or racketeering, shifted their focus to his finances, seeking to bring him down on charges of tax evasion. The investigation into Capone's finances was led by Treasury Agent Elliot Ness, who had been tasked with investigating organized crime in Chicago. Ness and his team of agents, known as the Untouchables, were relentless in their pursuit of Capone. They gathered evidence, traced financial records, and used wiretaps to gather information on Capone's illicit activities. The government's strategy was simple: if they could prove that Capone was making millions of dollars from illegal activities and not paying taxes on it, they could lock him up for good. It was a strategy that Capone never anticipated, and it would prove to be the beginning of the end for him. Capone's defense team tried to argue that the charges against him were politically motivated, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. The IRS had successfully traced Capone's illicit wealth and found that he had been evading taxes for years. In 1931, Capone was convicted on charges of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. The conviction was a monumental victory for law enforcement, but it was also a bitter defeat for Capone, who had once thought himself invincible. Sentenced to serve his time at the infamous Alcatraz prison, Capone's life behind bars was a far cry from the lavish lifestyle he had once enjoyed. Alcatraz was a maximum security facility, known for housing the most dangerous criminals in the country. Capone, once the king of Chicago's underworld, was now just another prisoner, and his once feared reputation began to fade as he spent more time behind the cold, iron bars of his cell. Capone's time in prison was marked by physical and mental decline. The syphilis that he had contracted in his youth had begun to take its toll on him, eroding his mental faculties and leaving him a shadow of the man he once was. Capone, who had once been a calculating and shrewd businessman, now found it difficult to focus and think clearly. His once sharp mind was dulled by the effects of the disease, and his body, ravaged by years of excess, began to betray him. Capone's health continued to deteriorate, and by the time he was released from prison in 1939, he was no longer the man who had dominated the streets of Chicago. Upon his release, Capone withdrew from public life, retreating to a private estate in Palm Island, Florida. The man who had once controlled an empire now lived in isolation, cut off from the world he had once ruled. Capone's health continued to worsen, and in 1947, at the age of 48, he died from complications related to his long-standing illness. His death marked the end of an era in American organized crime. Capone's empire, once the most powerful in the country, had crumbled, and with his passing, the gangster era began to fade into history. Though Capone's physical presence was gone, his legacy lived on. His life, filled with both myth and tragedy, became the stuff of legend. His story was immortalized in books, films, and documentaries, and he became a symbol of the rise and fall of the gangster empire. But Capone's story also serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder that power, when built on violence and corruption, is ultimately fleeting. The man who had once been untouchable was now just another footnote in the history of organized crime, his name forever etched into the annals of American folklore. Capone's rise to power, his reign over Chicago, and his eventual fall from grace remain a defining chapter in the story of organized crime. His life was a testament to the dangers of unchecked ambition and the consequences of living a life without moral boundaries. In the end, Capone's legacy is not just one of crime and corruption, but also of a man who built an empire, only to watch it collapse under the weight of his own hubris. His story is one of both triumph and tragedy, a story that continues to captivate the imagination of people around the world, long after the streets of Chicago were no longer under his control. Al Capone's final years are as much a part of his infamous legacy as his rise to power and his violent reign over Chicago's criminal empire. After his conviction in 1931 for tax evasion, Capone's life entered a new chapter, one marked by illness, isolation, and a fading memory of the once mighty gangster who had ruled Chicago from the shadows. His downfall, however, was not just a result of law enforcement's pursuit but of the relentless physical toll that his lifestyle had taken on him. The story of his decline is as tragic as it is telling, a reminder of the impermanence of power and the inevitable consequences of a life built on crime, excess, and violence. When Capone was sentenced to prison, he was sent to the most notorious facility in the United States, the infamous Alcatraz. The island prison, located in the cold waters of San Francisco Bay, had a reputation for housing the most dangerous criminals in the country. Alcatraz was designed to be inescapable, and its isolated location, surrounded by the turbulent waters of the bay, made it the perfect place to house men who were too dangerous or too influential to be kept in ordinary prisons. For Capone, however, Alcatraz was a far cry from the luxurious life he had led before his arrest. Gone were the days when he could enjoy lavish parties, expensive suits, and the adoration of his criminal associates. The walls of Alcatraz were cold and unforgiving, and Capone, once a feared leader, was now just another inmate among hundreds. At first, Capone's arrival at Alcatraz didn't seem to diminish his presence entirely. Even behind bars, he still maintained a degree of influence, and his name continued to command respect, even fear. Capone's reputation, after all, was built on a lifetime of ruthless ambition, and even in prison, there were those who still recognized the power that his name carried. But time, as it often does, wore away at him. Capone's health was in a rapid decline, and it was soon clear that the man who had once controlled the criminal underworld with an iron fist was no longer the same person. His once sharp mind, capable of calculating every move with the precision of a chess master, was dulled by the ravages of syphilis, a disease that he had contracted in his youth. The effects of syphilis on Capone were catastrophic. The disease, left untreated for years, slowly deteriorated his mental faculties. The man who had once been a calculating and strategic leader now found himself grappling with hallucinations, memory loss, and confusion. His once impressive intellect, the very thing that had helped him rise to the top of the criminal world, was now a shadow of its former self. Capone became a broken man, living in the confines of his prison cell, lost in a world of delusions and sickness. The power that he had so carefully cultivated over the years had slipped from his grasp, replaced by the overwhelming reality of his own mortality. As Capone's health deteriorated, his physical condition also worsened. The syphilis had taken a toll on his body as much as it had on his mind, and he became a frail, sickly figure, unable to care for himself as he once had. The once immaculate suit, the sign of his dominance and wealth, was replaced by the drab, worn-out prison uniform of an inmate. Capone was now living in a reality far removed from the luxury and decadence he had once known. The prison that had once been a symbol of his downfall was now the site of his personal decay. His health, however, was not the only thing that had deteriorated during his time at Alcatraz. His empire, too, had begun to crumble. The network of corrupt officials, politicians, and business associates that he had spent years building had begun to fall apart without his guidance. Capone's release from Alcatraz came in 1939, after serving only 8 years of his 11-year sentence. His deteriorating health was cited as the reason for his early release, but in reality, Capone was a shadow of the man he had once been. He was no longer the same calculating, strategic figure who had commanded the streets of Chicago. He was a sick, broken man, stripped of his former glory. His mental state had become so unstable that he was no longer able to carry out even the most basic functions. The man who had once been feared for his ability to eliminate rivals with ease was now so incapacitated that he could barely function. After his release, Capone was sent to his home in Palm Island, Florida, where he lived out the final years of his life in seclusion. The grand estate, which had once been a symbol of his power, was now a quiet, isolated retreat. Capone's days were filled with long periods of rest and reflection, though his mind was so damaged that he could no longer recall the details of his past. The world he had once ruled with fear and respect had slipped away from him, leaving him a mere shadow of his former self. Despite his decline, Capone was not entirely forgotten. His name, still associated with organized crime and the gangster era, continued to carry weight in the public imagination. Newspapers and tabloids still reported on his condition, and Capone's life continued to captivate the attention of the public. The image of the once feared gangster living out his final years in isolation was a poignant reminder of the fragility of power and the inevitability of decline. But for Capone, the end was drawing near. Capone died in 1947, at the age of 48. His death was not a dramatic one, but rather a quiet and sad conclusion to a life that had been marked by violence, ambition, and excess. The man who had once controlled a criminal empire and terrified the streets of Chicago was now gone, his empire reduced to ashes. His death was not the grand spectacle that many had imagined it would be, but rather a quiet passing that reflected the tragic arc of his life. In the years following Capone's death, his legacy continued to live on. He became a symbol of the gangster era, a figure whose name was synonymous with organized crime and the dangerous allure of the underworld. Books, films, and documentaries were made about his life, further cementing his place in American folklore. Capone's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the price of ambition and the inevitable consequences of a life built on crime. His rise to power, his reign of terror, and his ultimate downfall served as a stark lesson in the impermanence of power and the cost of living outside the law. But Capone's story also offers a deeper reflection on the human condition. He was a man who had everything, wealth, power, and influence, yet lost it all in the end. His rise to the top had been swift and brutal, but his fall was slow and painful. His legacy, built on fear and corruption, was ultimately hollow. The empire he had worked so hard to create was nothing more than a house of cards, easily destroyed by the weight of his own excesses and mistakes. His story is one of ambition, but also of loss and regret. In the end, Al Capone's life was a tragedy. His genius and ruthlessness allowed him to rise to the top of the criminal world, but his eventual downfall was inevitable. No matter how much power one accumulates, it is impossible to escape the consequences of a life of crime. Capone's story serves as a warning to all who seek to rise above the law through violence, manipulation, and corruption. It is a story of a man who had everything but lost it all, a man who built an empire that was ultimately destroyed by the very forces he had once controlled. In his final years, Capone had nothing left but his memories, and even those were slipping away as his mind deteriorated. His story, like his empire, had come to an end. As Al Capone's life continued its inevitable march toward its tragic conclusion, his legacy began to take on a life of its own. In the years following his release from Alcatraz and the slow decline of his health, Capone had become more of a symbol than a man, a figure from the past whose power was no longer felt, but whose name still carried weight. The world Capone had ruled had changed dramatically. The Roaring Twenties, the prohibition that had given rise to his empire, had faded into history. The criminal world was evolving, and law enforcement had grown more sophisticated. Yet Capone's mythic status as the ultimate gangster continued to grow, and his life story remained a focal point for those who sought to understand the brutal world he had once inhabited. Capone had always been a master of reinvention, constantly adapting to the world around him in order to maintain his position at the top. In the early years of his career, he had played by the unspoken rules of the streets, gaining power by using violence when necessary but also by making strategic alliances that ensured his success. He knew that the key to building a lasting empire wasn't simply about brute force, but about understanding human nature, exploiting the weaknesses of others, and maintaining a network of loyal supporters. Capone had cultivated a reputation as a man of power, a figure who could make things happen, whether that meant solving problems with cash or eliminating those who stood in his way. It was this combination of intellect and ruthlessness that allowed him to rise through the ranks of organized crime and ultimately take control of Chicago's underworld. However, Capone's story is not just one of violence and ambition. There was a more human side to the man behind the criminal empire, one that often gets overlooked in the larger-than-life narrative that surrounds him. Capone's relationships with family, friends, and even the public painted a picture of a man who was not entirely cold and calculating. In the years before his rise to power, Capone had been a man of modest beginnings. He had grown up in a working-class family, and his early years had been marked by a series of struggles. His parents had immigrated from Italy, and Capone had been raised in the tough, impoverished neighborhoods of Brooklyn. Like many young men in his position, he had found himself drawn to the streets, where he began his criminal career. What made Capone stand out, however, was his drive and ambition. From a young age, he had a clear sense of what he wanted and was willing to do whatever it took to achieve it. He was ruthless when it came to business, but he was also able to charm his way into the hearts of the public. In Chicago, Capone went from being just another face in the crowd to becoming one of the most influential men in the city. He wasn't just known for his violent tactics, he was also a man who understood the importance of public perception. He made sure to cultivate a public image of himself as a benefactor, someone who cared for the less fortunate. Capone funded charities, built schools, and even opened a soup kitchen during the Great Depression. To the poor and struggling citizens of Chicago, Capone wasn't just a gangster, he was a hero. But as his criminal empire grew, so too did the violence and the fear that came with it. The very methods that had helped Capone rise to power also became the forces that ultimately led to his downfall. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, which saw the brutal murder of 7 members of the Moran Gang, marked a turning point in Capone's reign. The massacre was a turning point not just in Capone's life but in the history of organized crime in America. It was a blood-soaked spectacle that shocked the nation, and the public's reaction to it was swift and severe. The government could no longer ignore Capone's role in the bloodshed, and law enforcement began to focus on bringing him to justice. But Capone was a man who had always evaded the law, and he continued to operate with the belief that he was untouchable. Despite the increasing pressure from law enforcement, Capone's empire seemed to be invincible. He had an extensive network of loyalists in positions of power, including politicians, judges, and police officers, all of whom were on his payroll. Capone had always understood that power was not just about money or muscle, it was also about relationships. He had cultivated relationships with key figures in both the criminal world and legitimate society, ensuring that his empire was well protected and insulated from outside threats. For a time, it seemed as though no one could touch him, and Capone's grip on Chicago remained unchallenged. But even Capone's vast network of influence was no match for the relentless pursuit of the federal government. The moment came when the authorities decided to go after Capone, not for his violent crimes, but for something more insidious, his taxes. In a world where gangsters like Capone could operate with relative impunity, the government realized that the key to bringing him down lay not in his many murders, but in his finances. Capone had spent years evading taxes on the millions of dollars he made from his illegal enterprises, and the government saw an opportunity to strike at the heart of his empire. It was a strategy that seemed almost too simple, but it worked. Under the leadership of Treasury Agent Elliot Ness and his team of agents known as the Untouchables, the government launched a full-scale investigation into Capone's finances. For the first time in his life, Capone found himself on the defensive. His vast empire, which had once seemed impervious to the law, was now under siege. The investigation was exhaustive, and the government carefully documented every illicit transaction that Capone had made. With each passing day, Capone's world grew smaller, and the once mighty gangster found himself increasingly vulnerable. In 1931, after a lengthy trial, Capone was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. The verdict was a monumental victory for the government, but it also marked the end of Capone's reign over Chicago's criminal underworld. He was sent to the notorious Alcatraz prison, where he would spend the next several years of his life. Alcatraz was a far cry from the lavish lifestyle that Capone had once enjoyed. The prison, which housed some of the most dangerous criminals in the country, was isolated and harsh. Capone, who had once been the man in charge, was now just another inmate in a cold, unforgiving environment. But Capone's time in prison was not without its challenges. His health, which had been deteriorating for years, continued to decline. The syphilis that he had contracted in his youth had taken a toll on his body and mind, and by the time he was sent to Alcatraz, Capone was already a shadow of the man he had once been. He became increasingly erratic, suffering from severe mental deterioration, which made his time in prison all the more difficult. The man who had once been feared for his ruthless efficiency and sharp intellect was now struggling to hold on to his mental faculties. His fall from power was as dramatic as his rise, and it seemed as though the man who had once controlled an empire was now being consumed by his own demons. By the time Capone was released from prison in 1939, he was a broken man. His physical and mental health had deteriorated to the point where he was no longer the man who had once ruled Chicago with an iron fist. He was no longer the shrewd and calculating gangster who had outsmarted his rivals at every turn. He was now a frail, sickly figure, barely able to remember his past, let alone relive it. Capone spent the final years of his life in seclusion, living in a private estate in Florida, far removed from the streets of Chicago that he had once dominated. The man who had once been the epitome of power and fear was now reduced to a mere shell of his former self. Capone passed away in 1947 at the age of 48. His death marked the end of an era, the end of the gangster age that had defined much of the early 20th century. Though he had once been the most feared criminal in the United States, his death was quiet and uneventful, a far cry from the dramatic life he had led. Capone's death, though not particularly sensational, left a lasting mark on American history. His name, synonymous with organized crime, became a symbol of the gangster era that had captivated the American public for decades. Despite his death, Capone's story continued to live on, with his life becoming a part of the folklore surrounding organized crime. His rise, his reign, and his ultimate fall serve as a powerful reminder of the dangers of ambition, greed, and the inevitable consequences of living outside the law. The story of Al Capone, from his rise to the pinnacle of power to his dramatic downfall, is not just one of crime and punishment, it is a tale of ambition, excess, and the fleeting nature of power. A man who had everything, Capone lost it all in the end, not because of his enemies or rivals, but because of the very choices he made. His life was a study in contradictions, a man who could inspire loyalty through fear yet show generosity to those in need, a man who ruled with violence, yet sought to protect his family and loved ones. The end of Capone's reign, and his ultimate fate, is a testament to the unrelenting force of time, the fragility of empires, and the inexorable truth that nothing lasts forever, especially when it is built on a foundation of blood and corruption. Capone's story, of course, was not without its high points. During his peak, he was one of the most powerful men in the United States, with control over vast swaths of the Chicago underworld. The city was his kingdom, and its streets, though dangerous, were as familiar to him as the back of his hand. He had created an empire that stretched beyond just the alcohol trade. Gambling, prostitution, and other illicit businesses all fell under his control, creating a web of operations that allowed him to rake in millions of dollars. With these resources, Capone didn't just control the streets, he controlled the lives of the people who lived in them. Capone's reputation as a criminal mastermind was not born out of luck. It was the result of years of careful planning, cunning, and ruthlessness. He understood that in order to succeed in the dangerous world of organized crime, one had to constantly adapt and outthink their rivals. Capone was not a man who relied solely on brute force, though he had no problem using violence when necessary. He knew that the key to his power was strategy and alliances. Throughout his rise, he cultivated relationships with influential figures, including politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials. These connections gave him the ability to operate with near impunity, evading justice time and time again. Yet, as Capone's empire grew, so did the danger surrounding it. He made enemies, not just in the criminal world, but in the legitimate world as well. His ability to outsmart the law made him a target, and it wasn't long before the government, driven by public outcry and the increasing violence associated with Capone's name, began to take action. The infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, in which 7 men from the Moran gang were gunned down in cold blood, was the catalyst that turned Capone from a feared gangster into a national symbol of organized crime. Although Capone was never directly implicated in the massacre, it was clear to the public and to the authorities that he was the one who benefited from it. The massacre marked a shift in the public's perception of Capone. The government could no longer ignore the extent of his criminal empire, and the pursuit of Capone intensified. But for all the law enforcement's efforts to bring him down, Capone remained elusive for a time. His ability to maintain control over Chicago was unmatched. He used fear, violence, and intimidation to eliminate rivals and keep his empire intact. His henchmen carried out his orders without question, and Capone himself was never far from the action. He was a hands-on leader who took pride in his ability to maintain order in his kingdom. He had become a larger-than-life figure, a symbol of power and corruption who operated above the law, seemingly untouchable. It was only when the government turned its attention to Capone's finances that the walls began to close in on him. The authorities knew that Capone had been evading taxes for years, and they saw this as their opportunity to take him down. It was a move that surprised many, for Capone had always been careful to avoid leaving a paper trail. But the government, led by Treasury Agent Elliot Ness and his team of untouchables, began to close in on his financial empire. Capone, who had long believed that his wealth and power would protect him, found himself vulnerable in ways he never expected. The IRS began to gather evidence, carefully tracking Capone's illicit transactions and uncovering a mountain of evidence that he had never paid taxes on the vast fortune he had amassed. In 1931, after a lengthy investigation, Capone was finally convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. The conviction, though not for his most violent crimes, was a massive blow to his empire. It marked the end of his reign as the undisputed king of Chicago's underworld. Capone was sent to the infamous Alcatraz prison, a maximum security facility that housed some of the country's most dangerous criminals. Alcatraz was a far cry from the luxurious life Capone had once enjoyed. The prison was isolated, surrounded by the cold waters of San Francisco Bay, and it was known for its harsh conditions. It was there, in the prison's solitary cells, that Capone would spend the remainder of his sentence. But Alcatraz was not just a prison, it was a symbol of Capone's ultimate fall from power. The man who had once controlled the streets of Chicago was now confined to a tiny cell on an island surrounded by cold, choppy waters. His health, which had been deteriorating for years, began to worsen in prison. The syphilis that had been left untreated for so long had taken a significant toll on his body and mind, and Capone, who had once been sharp and calculating, now found himself struggling with memory loss and confusion. His mental state became increasingly unstable, and the once feared gangster became a shadow of the man he had once been. Capone's time at Alcatraz was marked by isolation, illness, and a growing sense of helplessness. The man who had once been able to manipulate the world around him, who had controlled vast networks of criminals and politicians, was now powerless. He was no longer the man who had ruled over Chicago with an iron fist, he was a broken man, suffering from the ravages of disease and time. His empire had crumbled, and his body had betrayed him. The once mighty Al Capone was now reduced to a frail, sickly figure, struggling to hold on to what little of himself remained. In 1939, after serving only 8 years of his sentence, Capone was released from prison on account of his failing health. By this point, Capone was a mere shadow of his former self. His mind had been ravaged by syphilis, and his body was weakened by years of excess and illness. He retreated to a secluded estate in Palm Island, Florida, where he lived the remainder of his life in isolation. The man who had once been feared by the entire nation now spent his days in seclusion, a broken man with little to show for his years of power. Capone's final years were quiet, a stark contrast to the life he had lived in his prime. He spent his days reflecting on the empire he had built, the power he had once wielded, and the mistakes that had led to his downfall. His mental and physical health continued to decline, and by 1947, Capone had passed away from complications related to his long-standing illness. At the age of 48, the once great gangster was gone, his empire reduced to ruins. Al Capone's death marked the end of an era in American organized crime. The man who had once been the most feared gangster in the country had been brought down not by the violence of his enemies, but by the very system he had once manipulated. His story is one of tragic irony, a man who had achieved everything he had ever dreamed of, only to lose it all in the end. Capone's legacy lives on in popular culture, where his name is synonymous with organized crime. His life continues to be the subject of books, films, and documentaries, and his story remains one of the most captivating in American history. But Capone's story is also a cautionary tale. It is a story of ambition, excess, and the inevitable consequences of living a life outside the law. His rise to power was swift and brutal, but his fall was slow and painful. His empire, built on violence and corruption, crumbled under the weight of his own excesses and mistakes. In the end, Capone's story serves as a reminder that no matter how high one rises, the inevitable forces of time, law, and morality will eventually catch up with them. The man who once controlled an empire is now a symbol of the fleeting nature of power, a reminder that nothing, no matter how powerful or intimidating, lasts forever. The legend of Al Capone is one that has been etched into the fabric of American history, a story that is simultaneously one of power, ambition, and tragedy. He was a man who achieved more in his life than most could dream of, and yet, in the end, he lost everything. His empire, once untouchable, crumbled under the weight of his own actions. Capone's life is a stark reminder that no matter how high one rises, the price of ambition, greed, and violence can be steep, and the consequences inevitable. When Capone first arrived in Chicago, he was a young man with little more than ambition and the desire to make something of himself. Born into a poor Italian immigrant family in Brooklyn, Capone had always understood the harsh realities of life. His upbringing had been tough, and he learned early on that in order to survive, he had to be both tough and smart. This mentality led him into the world of organized crime, where he quickly rose through the ranks. His ability to make the right connections, his willingness to use violence when necessary, and his sharp business sense made him a natural fit for the criminal world. But Capone was more than just a gangster, he was a master of public relations. He understood that in order to maintain his power, he needed to control not just the criminal world but also the public's perception of him. During the Prohibition era, Capone became a household name, not just because of his violent actions, but because he became a symbol of defiance. He was the man who was willing to go against the law, to break the system, and to profit from it. He became an icon of rebellion, someone who stood up to the establishment, even as he built his criminal empire. But while Capone may have been a hero to some, he was a villain to many others. The very methods that made him successful, his ruthlessness, his willingness to kill without hesitation, his ability to manipulate and control, also made him one of the most feared men in the country. Capone's reign was marked by a series of brutal killings, including the infamous St. Valentine's Day massacre, which cemented his status as a ruthless and untouchable criminal mastermind. For Capone, violence was a tool, a means to an end, and he was willing to use it whenever necessary. The St. Valentine's Day massacre in 1929 was a pivotal moment in Capone's story, a moment that would come to symbolize the blood-soaked nature of his empire. 7 members of the rival Moran gang were lined up against a wall and gunned down in cold blood, a chilling execution that shocked the nation. Though Capone was never officially linked to the massacre, it was widely believed that he was behind it. The massacre marked the point where the public began to take a much harder look at Capone and his operations. The government, once unwilling to take serious action against him, now had no choice but to investigate the full extent of his criminal activities. As Capone's empire continued to grow, so did the risks associated with it. The more power he amassed, the more dangerous his position became. Capone made enemies not just within the criminal world but also in the legitimate world, where his influence and money began to corrupt politicians, police officers, and judges. Capone understood the power of influence, and he used it to his advantage, ensuring that no one would dare cross him. His grip on Chicago was ironclad, and for years, it seemed as though nothing could take him down.